Nightmare at the oil office, the mysterious disappearance. Blackwell Oil Corporation's offshore operations office, perched on the edge of the North Sea, was no stranger to the wild winds and chilling fog that engulfed Aberdeen, Scotland. For Dan Carter, an American expat who had lived in the city for 5 years, it was just another late-night shift at a company that was as cold and sterile as the sea it operated in. Yet tonight, there was something unsettling about the air. The dim lighting, the silence of the empty offices, and the eerie stillness outside created an atmosphere unlike any other. It wasn't long before Dan found himself alone with Jürgen Weiss, a brooding German logistics officer, the last 2 employees still lingering in the building. The others had left hours ago, their footsteps echoing away into the fog, but something felt off about tonight. The building, a massive structure of steel and concrete, always seemed to hum with life until tonight. Jürgen sat hunched over his desk, his eyes flicking over spreadsheets as the clock ticked past midnight. Dan, restless, wandered into the break room to make a cup of coffee. It was then that he noticed something peculiar. At the end of the hall, near the archives, a door stood. Dan frowned, his tired mind trying to process the sight. He had worked in this office for years, and he was certain there had never been a door there before. "Jürgen," Dan called, his voice breaking the silence, "come check this out." Jürgen didn't even look up from his screen. "What now, Carter?" "That door," Dan said, his curiosity piqued. "It wasn't there before, was it?" Jürgen blinked and finally glanced over. His face twisted in confusion. "There's no door. You're seeing things." "No, seriously. There's a door there now." "I'm not crazy," Dan insisted. Reluctantly, Jürgen stood and followed Dan down the dim hallway. The 2 men halted in front of the door. It was old, made of dark wood that seemed to sag under the weight of years. The tarnished brass handle was cold to the touch, and there was no sign or label of any kind. "That wasn't here this morning," Jürgen muttered, his voice now laced with a note of uncertainty. "Well, what do we do now? Open it?" Dan asked. "I don't know, Carter." Jürgen hesitated. "This doesn't feel right." Ignoring the warning in Jürgen's voice, Dan grasped the handle. It creaked loudly as he turned it, and with a forceful push, the door swung open. Beyond it lay a steep staircase, descending into darkness. The air that wafted up from below was cold and damp, laced with a faint scent of metal, like blood mixed with rust. The flashlight on Dan's phone flickered as he shone it into the abyss. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath. "There's no basement in this building." Jürgen's eyes narrowed. "I don't like this. Let's get out of here." But before they could retreat, a low, soft whisper echoed from the depths of the staircase. Dan froze, his heart thundering in his chest. "Did you hear that?" Jürgen stepped back, his voice shaking. "We need to go now. This isn't our building anymore." But the whisper grew louder, more insistent, like the call of something ancient, something evil. Dan's grip tightened on the flashlight. He couldn't explain it, but something was drawing him in, urging him to explore what lay below. "Stay here," he said to Jürgen. "I'll just take a quick look. We can leave right after." Jürgen opened his mouth to protest but seemed to change his mind. With a resigned sigh, he followed Dan down the stairs, though his eyes were wide with fear. The further they descended, the more suffocating the air became. The concrete walls of the building slowly gave way to rough-hewn stone, as if they had crossed into another world altogether. Dan felt a growing unease in his gut, but his curiosity pushed him forward. Finally, they reached the bottom of the staircase. Before them stretched a cavernous underground chamber, its size too vast to comprehend in the dim glow of their flashlights. The floor was covered in bones, human bones, some decayed and others disturbingly fresh. The very air reeked of rot and decay. In the center of the chamber, a massive gaping hole sat in the earth, its jagged edges glinting in the weak light. But it wasn't just the hole that caught their attention. A figure lurked at its edge, a humanoid shape but twisted and wrong. It was like nothing either of them had ever seen, with elongated limbs that bent at unnatural angles and a face that was nothing but a black void, an endless, bottomless abyss that seemed to suck in the light around it. Then, the voice. Low, guttural, and inhuman. It didn't come from any mouth, but from the very walls of the chamber, as if the air itself had spoken. You shouldn't have come. Jurgen let out a strangled cry and turned to flee, but the thing in the shadows moved faster than they could comprehend. Its limbs extended with terrifying speed, and in an instant, it was upon them. Jurgen's scream was cut off abruptly, his body jerking as if dragged into the darkness. Dan's heart pounded in his ears, and instinct took over. He turned and ran, not daring to look back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers followed, growing louder, more frantic, as though the very walls were closing in on him. The staircase seemed to stretch on forever, each step a painful reminder of how far he had gone from the safety of the office. Finally, Dan stumbled back through the door, gasping for air, and collapsed on the office floor. The hallway was empty, silent. The door was gone. His heart raced in panic as he scrambled to his feet, looking desperately for any sign of Jurgen. But there was nothing. The office was exactly as it had been when they first arrived, except for one thing: Jurgen was gone. Not a trace remained. His desk was untouched, his coffee mug still sitting on the counter. It was as if he had never existed. The police found nothing when they arrived. No sign of forced entry, no strange door, no underground chamber. Jurgen Weiss was gone without a trace. Dan was left to try and make sense of what had happened. But every night, as he lay in his bed, he could hear it, the whisper. The voice, calling to him, beckoning him back. The nightmares never stopped. They only grew worse. The thing that had taken Jurgen still lingered in the shadows, waiting for the next victim. And Dan knew, deep down, that it would come for him soon. You shouldn't have come, it whispered, louder now, as if it were just behind him. The very wall seemed to vibrate with its power. And Dan knew that it was only a matter of time before he would answer its call. Restaurant night shift, the shadow that followed me after closing. The dim lights of La Belle Nuit flickered weakly as I stood behind the counter, wiping down the last of the tables. It was the tail end of another typical night shift, and the few customers left had already paid and begun to file out. I loved the solitude of the late hours. The calm after the storm of dinner rush. The soft sound of classical music playing in the background and the clinking of glass as I finished the cleanup. There was something peaceful about it, like the whole restaurant was just waiting for the next day to begin. But that night, something changed. It started small, a feeling of being watched. I could feel it in the air, thick and suffocating. I shrugged it off. The place was old, and old buildings had their quirks, right? Then I saw the shadow. It was in the far corner of the dining room, just behind one of the tall plants near the window. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light or perhaps my imagination, but as I walked past, it stayed there motionless. I stopped for a moment, staring at it. Something about it didn't seem right. It wasn't just a shadow, it was as if the darkness itself had shape. Daniel? I called, my voice shaky, though I didn't know why I was so anxious. Daniel was the dishwasher, still in the back of the restaurant. He had probably heard me, but I heard no response. I approached the shadow, my feet barely making a sound on the creaky floorboards. The closer I got, the more I could feel it, an unnatural coldness in the air. The shadow didn't move. It was perfectly still, but I could almost feel it, watching. I took another step closer, my heart thumping in my chest. Then, the shadow shifted. It moved, but not in any way a normal shadow would. It didn't slide or flow. It shifted as though it was becoming something else. A vague outline of a tall figure appeared within the darkness, its shape indistinct and wrong. The light seemed to distort around it. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. Then, it was gone. Vanished into the darkness, leaving nothing behind but the eerie stillness of the room. Daniel? I called again, this time my voice trembling. Nothing. I rushed to the back of the restaurant, the kitchen bathed in the low glow of the fluorescent lights. The dishwasher was running, steam curling up into the air, but Daniel was nowhere to be found. His phone was on the counter, still playing a podcast, but there was no sign of him. And that's when I heard it. A whispering. Soft at first, just a barely audible murmur that seemed to come from all around me. It wasn't words, just an indistinct hiss, like voices overlapping. I looked around, panic rising in my chest. I turned to leave, but the sound, it was everywhere now. The whispering wasn't just in my ears. It was in the very walls, in the air around me. I turned back toward the dining room, and that's when I saw it. The figure. Standing in the doorway, just beyond the kitchen, it was tall, unnaturally tall. Its limbs were long, too long, stretching like darkened shadows into the air. It stood completely still, but I could feel it moving, watching me with unseen eyes. Its head tilted to the side, as if it were examining me. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't think. I just ran. I bolted out of the kitchen, past the dining room, and toward the front door. I could hear the whispering follow me, louder now, more distinct, but still unintelligible. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably, and finally managed to unlock the door. I burst outside, gasping for air, barely able to think straight. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind me. My hands were trembling as I started the engine, my heart pounding in my chest. I dared not look back. But just as I was about to pull away, I caught sight of it. The figure, standing just behind the glass door, staring at me with its long, twisted limbs and its head still tilted unnaturally. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze on me. And then, everything went black. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment. It was morning, and everything seemed normal, except for the lingering feeling of unease. I couldn't shake the images of that figure, the whispering that echoed in my mind. My phone lay beside me, a missed call from Daniel. But that was impossible. Daniel hadn't come back that night. And when I returned to the restaurant later that week, it was gone. The doors were locked, the windows dark, the La Belle Nuit sign hanging eerily above the entrance, untouched and still, as if it had never been used at all. No one had heard from Daniel since that night. They say he left town, that he disappeared. But I know better. The shadow still follows me. It's not just in the restaurant. It's in my dreams. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear the whispering again, close, too close. It waits for me. Night shift terror, strange encounters on the oil field. It was the kind of night that seemed like it could go on forever. The air was thick with an almost tangible humidity, a mix of sweat and the scent of oil that clung to everything. A full moon hung in the sky like a pale eye, casting eerie shadows across the vast, barren oil field. This was the third week of Marco's shift as a night supervisor, and although he'd grown accustomed to the isolation, the silence now felt different. The oil field stretched for miles in all directions, a sprawling maze of pumps, pipelines, and storage tanks that hummed with a low, monotonous rhythm. Marco had worked the night shift for years, but this was different. He could feel it in his bones, something was wrong, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. The other workers, a mix of seasoned oil rig veterans and transient laborers, usually took their breaks in the main building. Tonight, though, he was alone. He sat in the control room, the hum of machinery the only sound keeping him company. His eyes flicked nervously to the window, where the vast expanse of the field lay. Beyond the faint glow of the lamps, the dark horizon seemed to beckon. It was just after midnight when it started. Marco heard something whispers, faint at first, like a distant murmur carried by the wind. He frowned and stood up, looking around the small room. The radio crackled to life, and Marco picked it up. "Control room, this is Andy. Do you copy?" The voice was distorted, as if Andy's words were being drowned out by static. Marco grabbed the receiver, pressing it against his ear. "Andy? What's going on? You're cutting out." There was no response, just more static. He strained to hear, but all he could make out were odd sounds, like footsteps, shuffling across gravel. He ran to the door and pushed it open, scanning the empty yard. The wind had picked up, howling across the field, but there was no sign of anyone. He took a few cautious steps outside, his flashlight casting long shadows against the oil rigs and storage tanks. That's when he saw it. A figure. A tall, gaunt man, standing just beyond the edge of the nearest rig. His face was hidden in shadow, but Marco could tell he wasn't supposed to be there. Not one of the workers, not one of the regulars. Marco's heart raced as he took a step closer, calling out to him. "Hey! Who are you? You need to leave the premises." The figure didn't respond. Instead, he began to walk slowly toward the darkness, his movements almost unnatural, jerking with each step. Marco's pulse quickened. He wanted to run, but his legs felt frozen. The figure stopped, just beyond the light's reach, and then, without warning, he vanished. Marco blinked, rubbing his eyes. There was no sign of him. Just the empty stretch of oil rigs and the wind carrying the faint scent of petroleum. Something was wrong. Marco could feel it in his gut. He rushed back to the control room, locked the door, and grabbed the radio again. "This is Marco," he said, his voice shaky. "Can anyone hear me? I need a response. I've got a man here who doesn't belong." Silence. And then, the static returned. But this time, the voice that crackled through wasn't Andy's. "Leave. Go back inside," the voice rasped, its tone low and guttural. It was the voice of someone who had been dead for years, echoing through the static. Marco froze, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. He dropped the radio and stumbled backward. The door rattled, a thud shaking the control room as if something or someone was trying to break in. Desperate, Marco reached for the emergency phone to call for help, but as his fingers brushed the keypad, the lights flickered and went out, plunging him into darkness. His breathing grew heavy, the silence around him suffocating. He felt trapped, completely alone. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside the control room, slow and deliberate. Marco's heart pounded in his chest. He knew there was no one else on the field. The workers were either inside the break room or miles away in the barracks. This wasn't one of them. He stood there in the dark, paralyzed by fear, as the footsteps grew louder, closer. The door handle turned, and Marco held his breath. The door swung open. But there was no one there. Just empty air. Marco stepped into the hallway, his flashlight flickering on and off, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Every step felt like it took him deeper into the nightmare. He checked the security monitors, but the screens were blank. Nothing but static. It was as if the whole oil field had gone completely offline, disconnected from reality. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it again, the same figure, standing at the far end of the hallway, watching him. This time, Marco didn't hesitate. He turned and ran. His footsteps echoed through the empty building as he sprinted toward the nearest exit, but the field outside was no better. The oil rigs seemed to loom over him, casting long, monstrous shadows that danced in the light of his flashlight. The wind had turned into something more sinister, howling like a storm, rattling the old metal structures around him. Just as he reached the perimeter gate, the ground beneath him shook, and a low rumble filled the air, followed by a strange, otherworldly screech. Marco looked up, his eyes wide with terror. The sky had darkened further, as if something was blocking out the moon, casting the entire field into a permanent twilight. The figure appeared again, standing at the center of the field, but this time, it wasn't alone. Dozens of them, tall, gaunt, and faceless, lined the horizon, moving slowly, methodically, toward him. Marco backed away, his breath coming in ragged gasps. They weren't human. They couldn't be. Their limbs stretched unnaturally, and their bodies flickered like shadows caught between two worlds. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, the figures vanished. The rumble faded, the wind died down, and the field returned to its oppressive silence. Marco stood frozen, sweat dripping from his face, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. He wasn't alone anymore. But was he ever truly alone on the oil field? As the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, Marco stumbled back into the control room, his body numb from exhaustion and fear. He wasn't sure if it had been real, if it had all been a nightmare. But the empty radio, the flickering screens, and the lingering feeling that something had changed forever told him otherwise. The night shift on the oil field would never be the same again. And neither would he. Abandoned restaurant, the voices that followed me. Some places are abandoned for a reason. I used to think that every forgotten building had a story worth telling. I believed that peeling wallpaper and dust-covered tables were just remnants of time, waiting for someone like me to uncover their history. But some places don't want to be remembered. Some places remember you instead. I learned that the night I entered the restaurant. I was in a small European town, the kind with cobblestone streets, aging buildings, and a history stretching back centuries. I had come for my blog, documenting lost places and forgotten landmarks. The town was friendly at first. The locals smiled politely, offered homemade pastries, and answered my questions about historical sites. But the moment I asked about abandoned places, their faces changed. Their smiles faded. Their eyes darted away. "There's nothing like that here," one old man muttered, stirring his coffee with slow, deliberate motions. But there was. I had seen it when I arrived at a building at the end of a long, overgrown path, its faded sign hanging by a single rusted chain. The windows were too dark, too empty, as if they had never held light to begin with. A restaurant. And yet, no one spoke of it. That only made me more curious. The building loomed in the moonlight, its decayed frame barely holding itself together. The front door was locked, but as soon as I touched it, the wood groaned, and the latch slid open on its own. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of rotten something sweeter, something that made my stomach turn. Tables were still set with plates and cutlery, though everything was coated in a layer of dust thick enough to muffle my footsteps. It was as if the place had been waiting. I took out my camera and snapped a picture. Then I looked at the screen. And I froze. The tables weren't empty anymore. In the photo, they were filled with people, ghostly figures in elegant 1920s attire, their hollow eyes staring directly at me. I lowered my camera. The room was still empty. A chill crawled up my spine. My instinct screamed at me to leave. Then I heard it. A whisper. "We've been waiting for you." I turned toward the sound. The kitchen door had swung open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. My pulse pounded in my ears, but something, a force I couldn't explain, pulled me forward. The moment I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. The air was damp. The walls pulsed as if they were breathing. A dim light flickered from a single, swinging bulb, casting twisted shadows along the floor. And then I saw them. Figures stood around an old stove, their backs to me. Their bodies were wrong, too tall, too thin, their necks craned at unnatural angles. They murmured to each other in a language I didn't recognize, voices layered over one another like an off-key choir. I tried to step back. But the floor wasn't solid anymore. It sank beneath my feet, soft and wet. I looked down. Faces. The floor was made of faces, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes darting wildly. A cold hand gripped my wrist. I turned sharply, my breath catching in my throat. A man stood before me, or at least something that had once been a man. His face was stretched, his mouth twisted into an impossibly wide smile. His teeth were jagged, uneven, too many. "You're staying for dinner," he said. The others turned toward me then. All at once. And they smiled. I don't remember how I escaped. One moment, I was drowning in a sea of writhing faces. The next, I was outside, gasping on the cold pavement. The restaurant was gone. Not abandoned. Not ruined. Just gone. As if it had never been there. I left town that night. But the voices never left me. They whisper when I try to sleep. They murmur behind me when I walk alone. And every night, just as I close my eyes, I hear the same words, spoken in dozens of voices, all at once. "We've been waiting for you." Petrol station closure, the haunting silence of the night shift. It was a cold, unassuming February evening when Alex, a young worker at a remote petrol station, clocked in for his shift. The station was situated on the outskirts of a small, sleepy town in the middle of nowhere, a place where the wind always seemed to howl louder at night and the world outside seemed to fade into the shadows. The station, though far from glamorous, had its regulars and provided a simple life for those who worked there. Alex had been assigned to the night shift, a task usually given to the newcomers, with the promise of quiet solitude and the occasional late-night customer. As the night unfolded, Alex settled into the rhythm of the graveyard shift. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights above, the repetitive buzz of the pumps, and the occasional sound of a passing car were the only things that kept the silence at bay. But something felt off tonight. The air seemed heavier, thick with an unseen tension, as if the very walls of the station were listening, waiting. Around midnight, as the temperature dropped even further, Alex noticed an old, beat-up car pulling into the station. Its headlights flickered unnervingly, like the car was struggling to keep its last breath. The driver, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes, stepped out, his movements slow and deliberate, almost too perfect. Alex greeted him, but the man said nothing in return. Instead, he began to fill his tank, his eyes never leaving Alex. The quiet was unnerving, and Alex felt a strange chill crawl up his spine. The wind outside had picked up, and the distant sound of branches scraping against the windows made him shiver. The man finished fueling, paid without saying a word, and left as suddenly as he had arrived. Alex stood there, unsure of what had just transpired, but unable to shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't until later, when the moon was high and the only sounds were the occasional drip of water from the leaking roof, that the true horror began. A soft, almost imperceptible tapping echoed through the station. At first, Alex thought it was just the wind or a rat in the walls. But the tapping persisted, rhythmic and deliberate, as if it were coming from within the building itself. He checked the security cameras, but the screens only displayed static. The tapping grew louder, now accompanied by a faint whisper, like a distant voice calling his name. Alex, trembling, decided to investigate. He walked cautiously toward the back of the station, where the sound seemed to be coming from. The narrow hallway leading to the storage room was dimly lit, the flickering lights casting long shadows on the walls. As he approached the door, the whisper grew clearer, now unmistakable, "You're not supposed to be here." The door creaked open on its own, revealing a room that had always been locked, a room Alex had never seen. Inside, the air was thick, and a faint glow emanated from the corner of the room. As he stepped closer, his heart began to race. In the corner stood a figure, hunched and shrouded in darkness. It was the same gaunt man from earlier, but his face, if it could even be called a face, was now twisted and contorted in a grotesque, unrecognizable way. His hollow eyes were wide open, staring directly at Alex, and his mouth, stretched impossibly wide, whispered something in a language Alex didn't understand. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out completely, plunging the station into darkness. The air grew colder, and Alex felt something cold and clammy wrap around his ankle. He screamed, pulling away, but the grip tightened. He looked down to see a pale hand emerging from the floor, its fingers long and skeletal, pulling him closer to the ground. Panicked, Alex stumbled backward, desperately trying to break free from the invisible hold, but the whispers grew louder, now filling the entire station. He could feel the presence of something ancient, something malevolent, watching him from every corner. The walls seemed to close in on him, and the very air around him felt suffocating. In a final burst of terror, Alex ran to the front door and tried to escape. But it was no use, the door wouldn't open. It was as if the station itself had become a trap, an entity of its own that was alive, feeding on the fear of anyone unlucky enough to cross its threshold. The whispers intensified, now echoing in his mind, urging him to stay, to never leave. The walls seemed to pulse with each heartbeat, each breath, as if the station was alive, hungry, and waiting for him to surrender. As the hours dragged on, the silence of the night became unbearable, and Alex's sense of reality began to blur. He no longer knew if the tapping, the whispers, or the figures in the shadows were real or if he was simply losing his mind. But one thing was certain, the petrol station was not just a building, it was a prison, a haunting place that fed on the souls of those who worked within its walls, trapping them in its eternal silence. And as the first light of dawn began to break, the station fell still once again. The door swung open on its own, and the car that had arrived earlier reappeared, as if it had never left. But Alex was nowhere to be found. The petrol station stood alone, as it always had, silent and waiting for the next soul to enter.